Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here today and to represent Class 5. I still remember the circumstances that compelled me to attempt my first psychology experiment. It was my 5th birthday. Growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, there was nothing better I could imagine than becoming 5 years old. I was the 5th child of 5. I was born in the 5th month of the year in 1965. I even liked the sound of 5. Well, I had a big party to celebrate my big day, and this meant that my mother baked me a cake, and she, my sister, and the girl next door stuck 5 candles in it and sang happy birthday to me around our kitchen table. And I still remember blowing out those candles thinking, this is the happiest day of my life. It was a moment that I had been waiting for, and I wished for nothing else but to keep that moment alive. But then things took an unexpected turn. As the day went on, it dawned on me that in a year, I'd have another birthday, and I'd be 6. And I remember thinking, dang, you know, all I wanted was to stay 5, right? and I was realizing that that just wasn't going to happen. So within minutes, I went through all the different phases one goes through to mourn the loss of a dream. I felt angry, you know. I was in denial. I accepted it. I felt sadness. I recognized the tragedy. And just when I thought I could move on, things took another unexpected turn. I realized that it was worse than I thought. Every year, I would have another birthday. I realized for the first time that there was no turning back. Every year, things would change and I would change. And when someone asked me, how old are you? I would never again have the pleasure of saying, I'm 5, right? I would cease to exist as a 5-year-old. I would cease to exist as a child. Myself as I knew me would never walk the face of the earth again. So I was in full panic. Something had to be done. And so that's when I attempted my first psychology experiment. I got an idea for an experiment, and I thought to myself, if this works, I live. If this fails, I die. So I stepped to it. There was no pilot testing. I hadn't done the reading. But what could I do? You know, there was too much at stake. So I stepped into the center of my bedroom with mess all around me. And I closed my eyes, and I began my first experimental manipulation. With my eyes closed, I said, this is what it feels like to be 5. I'm feeling what it feels like to be 5. I clenched my small fist, and I said, this is what my body feels like when I'm 10 years old, when I'm 15, when I'm 25, when I am 50. I will come back to this feeling. I'll come back to this self. I'll come back to this, the happiest time of my life. It's been nearly 47 years now since I conducted that first psychology experiment, and I still remember what it feels like to be 5. So in no small way, my first experiment worked, right, in spite of its weaknesses. And the methodological and logistical weaknesses were quite severe, right? Obviously, I had a pretty limited sample size. And then, of course, there was the problem that the experiment had only one condition, and the one participant in that one condition was not kept blind to the purposes of the study. And then there was this added complication that I was forced to play the role of both the study participant and the principal investigator. And I hate to mention this one, but there was no funding to keep that study going. Now, I also made a critical conceptual miscalculation, and in fact, it's because I corrected that conceptual miscalculation that I stand before you here today. You see, I thought that change could only be a bad thing. There seemed to be too many uncertainties, too many places to travel to never be heard from again. There seemed to be too much at stake in letting go. Yet I made a misstep here too. When I was 5, I had no idea that I was born in the wake of the civil rights movement. And let me tell you something. Change can be a beautiful thing. Today, I conduct research on race and inequality. I've turned my attention to the wide-ranging effects of stereotyping on our criminal justice system. I study how stereotypic associations infect our vision of the world, how these associations lead us to see and retain certain things and not others, how these associations compel us to take certain actions and not others. The lay view on racial bias is that it's rare, deliberate, it's a moral failing. These features of bias lead us to imagine burning crosses and bad actors inspired by hate. Now, I'm a social psychologist. My work stands in stark contrast to this lay view on race. Yet it's consistent with lots of other work in social psychology. And the basic ideas are that bias can influence us more often than we think, that we can act on bias unintentionally. So at times where we don't even know we're thinking about race, we could be thinking about race. And most importantly, bias does not require bad actors. Instead, bias can be triggered by the situations we find ourselves in. My work demonstrates how implicit bias may be altered or I guess affected by various actors in the criminal justice system and how that can be addressed. And I use a particular stereotypic association to make my point, and that's the Black Crime Association. And to demonstrate the power of this association, I want to take you through a short tour of empirical studies that were conducted in my lab. And we're going to just make 3 stops today on this tour. And for our first stop, we're going to talk about how this Black Crime Association can affect what we see. And the idea here is that blacks are so associated with crime that the mere presence of a black face can lead us to see weapons better. So in other words, this Black Crime Association can dictate which objects we see in the world and which we don't. So to examine this, we invited undergraduates into our lab. We had them sit in front of a computer. And then they saw this focus dot at the center of the computer screen, and then they saw flashes of light appear around that focus dot. Now, these flashes were actually the faces of young men that were being presented on the screen at such a rapid rate that the participants couldn't consciously detect them. So I'm going to show you that again here in slow motion. So we used this subliminal priming procedure to expose 1/3 of our study participants to a whole series of black male faces. We exposed another 1/3 to a whole series of white male faces. And then the final 1/3 were not exposed to any faces at all, okay? And then after this subliminal priming procedure, we took them through what we called an object recognition task. It was supposedly unrelated to this other task that they just completed. And for this task, the goal was to just recognize the objects that appeared on the screen as quickly as possible. Now, these objects appeared on the screen one at a time, and each object started out where it's really blurry and out of focus, and slowly in 41 steps or 41 frames, that object became clear. So I want to show you here at frame 1, just as an example, showing you just critical points along the continuum, so you can see by frame 41, you know what the object is. Now, the participants were exposed to crime-relevant objects like guns and knives, and they were also exposed to crime-irrelevant objects like staplers and cameras and so forth. Okay? And we hypothesized that the participants who had been exposed to these black male faces beforehand, that they would need fewer frames to recognize what these crime objects were, okay? And so here's the data from that study. And along the y-axis, we have the frame number at which they could recognize the object. That's going from 1 where it's blurry to 41 where it's clear. And first, we're going to look at what happens for the crime-irrelevant objects. And you can see here, for the crime-irrelevant objects, it doesn't matter if you're exposed to the black faces or the white faces beforehand. You know, you're recognizing those crime-irrelevant objects at the same point along the continuum, at about the midpoint of the continuum. Now, let's look what happens with the crime-relevant objects. So we can see here that just exposure to these black male faces beforehand led them to need fewer frames. They needed less information before they could say, well, that's a gun or that's a knife. And we get just the opposite effect with exposure to the white faces beforehand, right? They need more information. They need more clarity before they could say, that's a gun or that's a knife. So the black male faces facilitated the detection of the crime objects, whereas the white male faces inhibited their detection of those very same crime objects. Now, this particular study was conducted with both white and non-white students, and we found that the race of the study participant didn't make any difference, right? So we get the same pattern of results regardless of the student's race. Now, for the next stop on the tour, I want to tell you about another study conducted in my lab. And here, we were interested in how this black crime association can influence where we look. And so this time, we took half of the study participants, and we exposed them, or subliminally primed them, with crime-relevant images on the computer screen. And so you just saw that in slow motion. And then next, we had all the participants look at these two faces, a black face and a white face that appeared on the computer screen simultaneously. And we found for those participants who had been exposed to the crime objects beforehand, so for those participants who had been prompted to think about violent crime, their attention went away from the white face and towards the black face. And we conducted the same study with police officers, and police officers show the same tendency. When we expose police officers to words associated with violent crime, they too directed their attention away from the white face and towards the black face. And so for here, police officers were exposed subliminally to words like capture, arrest, shoot, apprehend. And those words, activating those words, placed the black male face under surveillance. So the Black Crime Association can influence where we look, it can influence what we see, it can also influence how we punish. So for the final stop on the tour, I want to talk to you about a study I conducted with Rebecca Hetty, who's a former graduate student at Stanford. And here we were interested in how the blackness of a prison population could influence how we punish. In particular, we were interested in how racial disparities in imprisonment could influence our support for punitive crime policies, policies like 3 strikes. And at the time we conducted this study, the state of California had one of the harshest three strikes laws in the country. Under three strikes in California, you could get a life sentence for stealing $1 in loose change from a parked car if you had 2 prior felony convictions. So for this study, we went to a train station in California near Stanford University, and we collected data on people's support for three strikes. We approached train riders to participate, and we told them we were interested in the various social issues that we were facing as a state, and one of those issues was incarceration. And using iPads, we showed them some of the faces of people who were incarcerated at the time. And for half of the study participants, they saw this set of images where 25% of the inmates depicted were black. And this percentage of inmates depicted who were black was the true percentage of California prisoners who were black at the time we conducted the study. And the remaining participants saw this set of images. And this is where 45% of the inmates depicted were black. And this higher percentage represented the true percentage of three-strike inmates who were black. Next, we informed our participants that an effort had begun across the state to amend the three strikes law so that the third crime a person committed would have to be a violent crime in order for this law to take effect. And at the very end of the study, we told them that, here are some petitions, so you could actually look at the petition, and we gave them the option to sign that petition to place that amendment on the ballot in November of 2012. And so they were told that if they chose to sign this petition, we would forward their name to the state attorney general, which we did. So for this study, we had a true sort of behavioral measure that had real political consequence. So first, we're going to look at what happened for the sample of study participants who were exposed to the less black condition. And we could see here about half of these people signed the petition in this case. What about those who were exposed to the prison population that was more black? We could see here that only 28% of those people signed that petition. So the blacker the prison population was represented as being, the less willing people were to support decreasing the severity of the law. Race also can influence how we punish children in our criminal justice system. For example, simply being reminded of a black juvenile defendant who's committed a violent crime leads people to think about juveniles in general as closer to adults in their culpability. And this leads them to express greater support for life in prison without the possibility for parole for juveniles. As a 5-year-old, I could not imagine who I would be or where I would be or what I would do for a living by the time I hit 50. Yet I can still see my 5-year-old self. The self that led me to use everything within my power to understand human perception, and how that perception can get altered by the circumstances we find ourselves in. That self continues to serve as my anchor. I thank her, I thank my family, and I thank my students and my colleagues at Stanford. And I thank you for listening. Thanks.
Don't go yet.
Oh, sorry.
Are there any questions? Yes. Uh-huh. Yes. Yes, that was very interesting. I'm over here. And I,
Sorry, I need glasses. Go ahead.
From listening to you, it makes me think the best way to solve this problem is a subliminal one, which I am sure would be illegal. And so I'm just, with all of your knowledge, and I'm asking you to sort of step outside of your lab and say, what do you think is the way to deal with bias? How can we go forward without bias? If there was one thing, what would you say?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. Most of my career I've spent just kind of documenting, the issues and kind of documenting how race can influence us more than we think and influence our perception and behavior and so forth. And, I more recently have come to this question myself about what it is we can do, and as social psychologists, what can we share about what we know about how bias works. And I've been doing a lot of work lately, trying to address this issue in the policing industry in particular. And there, with Hazel Marcus, my colleague at Stanford, we've been, offering trainings to police officers in different parts of the state, and that training to help them to see, how race can influence their perception and behavior in the policing context. I've also, with colleagues at Stanford in the psychology department and in the linguistics department, we've begun to analyze body-worn camera footage from police officers to try to, look at these interactions with the community members as they unfold, to try to use that information, that's coming to us in real time to help to them to offer ways to de-escalate situations and to improve those interactions more generally. And I'd say the final thing is just using what we know as social psychologists about the situational triggers of bias to offer that information to law enforcement agencies to use as they develop policy and as they develop various enforcement strategies. So we know, for example, that bias increases with fatigue, with threat, with fear, when there's time pressure. So there are a lot of situational triggers of bias that, to some extent, are under our control. So I think I should stop that. The red light's been blinking for a while. So,
okay, there's one more question here.
Is it okay? Okay,
yes,
thanks.
Talk. I have one question for you. As you said, race did not matter or influence in your first experiment. Did the students parent socioeconomic class, or whether they went to a public or private high school matter?
Oh, yeah, so we didn't actually measure, we didn't look at, the public versus private schools, and these were undergraduates at Stanford and at UC Berkeley, and so there wasn't, a huge range in terms of the SES, but I think the issue here is that it's not like a particular type of person or a particular group where we think, okay, you're likely to find bias in them, but it's all of us, really. I mean, it's how we've been socialized in this country, the kinds of racial disparities that we witness on a daily basis in this country. All of that matters, and all of it affects us. And all of that knowledge and that information can be, triggered in different situations. So we didn't expect to find actually differences between white and non-white study participants when we looked at that. So,
thank you.
Thanks.